Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Craig Guyman and I work with Binalyze. Today I would like to provide a high-level introductory demo of the latest version of Binalyze AIR, version 3.0.5. As a reminder, Binalyze AIR is an automated web-based incident response platform. It allows DFIR teams the ability to perform several functions, such as lightning-fast endpoint acquisitions, endpoint analysis, and performing enterprise-wide IOC triage and endpoint remediation. It provides many advantages for forensic and incident response analysts, which I will share with you today in this video. The first thing to know about AIR is how simple it is to be deployed. Because it is Docker-based, it can be deployed on-premise or on a server in your AWS or Azure cloud. AIR is built on a hierarchy of organizations, cases, and endpoints. Let's start today by discussing organizations. Organizations can be accessed by clicking on the building in the top right corner of the platform interface. If I click on New Organization, I can type in the name of an organization such as Blue Ridge Cyber. I can type in the name of the contact, the title of the person that will be the primary contact at that organization, and all of their other ancillary information. It's also important to note the shareable deployment page link that's toggled on. I've covered this in other videos as well. This allows you to easily share a deployment link with users that you would wish to share an endpoint agent on. Click on Save. This logical container is now created and available for you to use. You're now able to start deploying agents to that system. Let's demonstrate the other primary advantages of Binalyze AIR by deploying agents to that endpoint. I also want to point out that the other hierarchical elements of Binalyze AIR are also on the left side of the screen, including endpoints and cases. Within cases and within endpoints, you'll have tasks that we'll cover as well. If we click on endpoints, I have the ability to choose an endpoint that I want to deploy to. Binalyze AIR has the ability to deploy to traditional endpoints such as Windows, Mac, Linux, as well as Chromebook and ESXi VMware systems. We also have the ability to deploy to EC2 instances in AWS, VMs in Azure, and soon to be the Google Cloud Platform as well. Additionally, we have the ability to collect information from off-network systems, and I'll cover that in another video. For now, let's focus on deploying to an endpoint. I've created other videos on this, but let's quickly go over this today. We'll say Save and Next, and we'll deploy this to a Windows endpoint, and you can have the choice of deploying to an endpoint using a PowerShell command, PowerShell script, downloading the MSI, or sharing the link that can be accessed on the endpoint you wish to deploy the agent to, as well as deploying through Active Directory's SCCM using the silent installation methodology. Once you've successfully deployed the agent to your system, you'll have the ability to choose that system inside of the interface. If I choose that under Binalyze EU, I'll select the endpoint that I've deployed the agent to, and we'll focus on the next advantage of using Binalyze AIR, and that is that it simply has the ability to do much more than just acquire data from an endpoint. We have the ability to triage information using IOC rules or Sigma rules. We have the ability to remediate data from an endpoint. We have the ability to build a timeline out and enrich that timeline with data sources, including other endpoints and CSV data, as well as a patent pending comparison feature that I'll show you as well. If we start with the acquisition, we'll click on Acquire, and at this point you have the ability to leverage an already existing acquisition profile. We'll focus today on the use of the compromise assessment acquisition profile. This acquisition profile provides you a very speedy way with which to capture information from an endpoint. The compromise assessment acquisition profile only takes 3 to 5 minutes to collect the most beneficial endpoint artifacts, including, but not limited to, system processes, firewall rules, USB storage history, downloaded files, auto runs, browser history, shell bags, event records, and process execution artifacts such as prefetch, SRUM, and amcache. AIR also allows for offline endpoints to be easily added and incorporated into this incident investigation. For more information on the acquisition profiles, if we click on the acquisition section of the interface, you'll have the ability to look at exactly all the artifacts that are included in this acquisition profile. We give you an evidence list as well as an artifact list, the ability to build out custom content profiles, and to perform network captures. So you can capture TCP and UDP NetFlow information, PCAPs up to 60 minutes, and this is also true of all of the OS platforms we support, including Linux, Mac, as well as an e-discovery collection type, which we'll cover in a future video. When you perform an acquisition using the acquisition compromise assessment acquisition profile, you'll have the ability to select some other options here as well. These are important to go over as these differentiate our platform from other traditional tools. The first differentiator is that we'll be processing the data on the local endpoint from which it's being collected. As a result, that data will by default stay on the local system. However, you have the ability to change the path of where it's stored on that evidence on that endpoint, or better yet, leverage an evidence repository such as an Azure blob or an S3 bucket. By clicking on the evidence repository list, you have the ability to share to an SMB, SFTP site, FTPS site, or an S3 bucket or Azure blob. You also have the ability to limit the amount of CPU that might be used on that endpoint when processing that data. However, it should be noted that because processing happens so quickly, you oftentimes don't even need to limit the CPU because these collections will be done in 3 to 5 minutes. You also have the ability to compress and encrypt these images so as to protect them and keep them as low sized as possible. We also have the ability to leverage some of our post-processing tasks such as Drone. Drone is our post-processing analyzer, and when you turn off autopilot, you have a visibility into the specific analyzers that we've built using our DFIR lab internally. We've recently added the MITRE ATT&CK scanner in version 3.0.5, but we also have a browser history analyzer all the way down through to shellbag analyzers and a ransomware identifier. These are important because they'll help examiners and analysts to identify important nefarious potential activity in the report that we'll go over in just a moment. In fact, let's go over that report now. If you go to the bottom of your task list, you'll notice that each of the tasks has an individual icon to view the report. When we click on that report, you have the ability to look at it in another tab. We'll start with the case information, which will include a screenshot in many cases, your case ID, all the way through to the status of this particular case. The second category will include that drone section that I just discussed in the previous step. This will give you verdicts and scores that might be important to start with as you start your analysis on that particular system. You also have basic system information, as well as all the artifacts that were collected during the acquisition phase will then be listed in this report. If we start with the drone items, we can drop down into the processes and easily identify that SVC host and dvm.exe both have some suspicious and relevant activity associated with them. If we hover over the relevant or suspicious finding, you'll find out exactly why this was tagged. In the case of the svc host.exe file, this happened in a relevant time period. It's also a very small file and has strange orphan processes. You can then tag this item or bookmark this item as you see fit. As you do that, you'll notice that the bookmark count will increase on the top right corner of the report. If at this point you wish to do global searching across the report, you can simply do that by typing in your keyword of choice. And what you'll notice is that you'll have responses in those individual categories where that keyword has a hit. So for example, I'm looking at parsed prefetch files. I can see that this dvm.exe file was in fact run one time from this particular file path. I can also see that firewall rules changed as a result of dvm.exe. Both UDP and TCP firewall rules were allowed, and I can look into this into more detail as I start to look into the timeline, which we'll jump into in just a moment. Beyond drone and beyond the report that's very easy to get to, you have the ability to also leverage other reporting mechanisms within the drone console, the AIR console. The AIR console gives me the ability to build out a timeline, which ultimately is something I'm very interested in getting to very quickly. I've pre-built a timeline in this case, but to show you how that's done, I can simply click on Create Timeline, and when I do that, a timeline of events will then appear. What's really cool about this particular timeline is that I have the ability to add and enrich data to this particular report. So as I have other endpoints that become clear are also affected by this particular exploit, I can add them to this timeline. One of the ways to do that is to start by running a Yara triage or a IOC triage across your organization to determine if you have other systems in your organization that might also be affected by the IOC that you found in your first case. To do that, you can click on the triage tab, and when you click on the triage tab, you can associate this with a case. We haven't created a case, but there are some cases already created in this. If I wanted to create a new one, I could just call this Blue Ridge Cyber, and I can associate that with an organization and save that so that it's publicly visible. Now that I've got that case created, I can either leverage existing IOCs that have already been built or create a new one. We do have a variety of different Yara rules that are already in the system by default, including FireEye Red Team Tools countermeasures, all the way up through core web shell detections. If you choose to build a new Yara rule, you can simply click on New Yara rule and leverage that running against memory or file system, upload your own rules, or create a new rule at your convenience. If you have the ability to upload a rule, you just click on Upload Rule and point to the Yara rule that you have in mind. If you want to use one of our example rules, you can just simply come in here. We'll use the hash value. If, for example, for my report, I had a hash value that was one I wanted to focus on for IOC triage, I could just replace this hash value in this, save this, and when I do that, I can then run that in other Yara rules across the organization. You can see here on the left side, any of these organizations have the ability for me to expand them, and as I expand them out, I can go into these tagged sections, and for example, I could run these all across all suspect machines or all mail servers. I could run that triage across those systems as well as scheduled acquisition tasks if I wanted to. In this case, I've already started that IOC triage and it's running in the background. Once that's done, I can then start adding resulting information to my timeline that I just showed you just a moment ago. If I go back into the timeline, I can also add off-network information that might be useful from systems that don't have internet connection. We'll cover off-network collections in another video. I also have the ability to add CSV data, for example, from a SIM tool that might allow me to have a more holistic view of what's going on within this system, not just at the endpoint, but from the SIM's point of view as well. I also have the ability to add milestone data. So perhaps we've terminated an IT admin recently, or the organization you're working with has recently done so, and you want to be able to know what other activity happened on that system right around that same time. So I could choose to push this back into, say, for example, June 21st, 2022, save that. That will then add a pinpoint on my timeline, and I can start to look at activity around that date and time. For example, I may want to know if that user successfully or unsuccessfully logged in after they were terminated to determine whether or not their credentials were successfully closed out. So if I come in and do 4625, I can identify whether or not there are any failed login attempts, or if there are any successful login attempts, I can use 4624. If in fact this was the user we just recently terminated and it happened to be around the time that they left the company, this might indicate that they were trying to gain illegal access to systems after they were terminated, which might be something I want to tag as highly relevant or suspicious or dangerous. Once doing that, I have the ability to continue filtering this data by adding conditions. I can add multiple conditions to this if I want. I can add conditions such as usernames, event types, and flags. Event types might include different events from event logs, and I can add user information such as a username that might specifically be trying to do something that we're looking to investigate. I'll close that out, and we'll go back to our endpoint details for a moment. We've covered our report that we get from the acquisition. We've covered the triage capability, and we've covered the timeline. I'd now like to cover our comparison capability. The comparison capability allows you to take a baseline image of a system and compare that to a more recent collection from a system. In this case, we've already got one done here, and we can pull that up. That comparison will look like this on a Windows system. What we're targeting to look at is installed applications, firewall rule changes, driver changes, service autoruns, scheduled task autoruns, registry autoruns, and that will cover any additions, changes, or deletions. If, for example, we look at the changes, we can focus primarily on just the firewall rules, and when we do that, we can see a list of different firewall rules that have changed. So Spotify Music changed our TCP outbound firewall rules. This may be applicable to our investigation, and if so, I can use this created date as a milestone to add to my timeline later and look at other activity that might have happened during this time. For example, this firewall rule may have also precipitated an upload or an exfiltration of data out of our network, or maybe USB activity that I want to look at in the timeline as well. So being able to pivot on this particular date and time from this comparison feature allows us very, very clear ways to investigate this particular system. The last feature that we'll show today is our interact capability, which is our cross-platform remote shell. When you open up Interact, you have the same capabilities of using the options and limiting the CPU and compressing the image that you have in other tasks performed in Binalyze AIR, such as acquisitions. I'm going to choose to leave this downloaded, and I'm going to associate this with our new Blue Ridge Cyber case, and I'm going to say Start. When I say Start, this will initiate the shell session to that system, in this case, the infected system. I have a resource usage tab here indicating if there's unusual activity happening on that system, such as perhaps I'm pushing the limits on the CPU and I want to reduce the CPU limit. I have some visibility into that when I'm doing that. If I type help, I have the ability to get a complete list of all the comprehensive arguments I can run on this particular shell session, including performing a find, performing a get, listing out processes using the PS list, running OS query, making a directory, or even imaging a system. If I type help image, for example, it will give me all the parameters needed in order to perform an image, which will create a DD image of this system. I also have the ability to list out all of the processes running on that system at any time, or run a clear and run an LS or a DIR from that system if necessary. I can also leverage a library. So if I have shell files or scripts that I like running, I can upload those to my library, import them in, and leverage them through this shell session. When I close this session, what will happen is a report will be created telling me exactly what get commands and what other arguments were run on that system when we were done. If I go into my task list, you'll be able to see a previous report on what was done. Any transferred files, in this case, these shell scripts were collected, and these commands were written on that session so as to be able to show that I ran those particular options and no other options if my requirements were to only run specific commands and stay away from other commands. I could prove that I was only doing that using this log file. This concludes the overview of Binalyze AIR today. I hope that was useful for you. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me at craig.guyman@binalyze.com. Thank you for your time.